misty hills of Colonial, Virginia, where abandoned tobacco fields fade into the morning fog, there lies a cemetery historians avoid mentioning. Beneath an ancient oak stand 5 identical headstones in a perfect row, each bearing the same surname and the same tragic detail, young men who all died at 21. What chills the blood isn't just the eerie symmetry of these deaths, but the records unearthed during a 1987 courthouse renovation, revealing that the family once had 7 children, unaware their father was quietly removing every son the moment he came of age and could threaten his absolute control. For over 2 centuries, the Aldermore estate kept its silence, masking a horror so carefully staged that even modern investigators struggle to believe one man could so thoroughly destroy his own family, while the world praised him as a devoted father. Before we continue into the Aldermore's terrible secret, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Have you ever seen strange patterns in your own family that made you wonder if so-called accidents were really accidents? The Aldermore name first appeared in Virginia's colonial records in 1682, when merchant ships from Bristol carried not just tobacco seeds, but men with ambitions as deep as the James River. Henry County in the late 1600s was the heart of tobacco country, where sprawling plantations and fortunes rose from dark, fertile soil. Into this world came Edmund Aldermore, 35 years old, with calloused hands, sharp gray eyes, and enough silver to buy 1,500 acres on the Appomattox River. On this land, he built Ashwood Manor, a Georgian mansion that quickly became the pride of the county. 3 stories of imported brick rose above manicured gardens, windows catching dawn light over endless fields. Inside, Caribbean mahogany panels, London chandeliers, and Persian rugs whispered of wealth. But it was Edmund's study that revealed his true nature. Lined floor to ceiling with ledgers detailing every profit and plan, this room was where he shaped the family's future with cold precision. In 1685, he married Constance Hartwell, a copper-haired, sharp-eyed 19-year-old from a prominent Norfolk family whose dowry and connections secured their place among Virginia's elite. Their first child, William, was born during a spring thunderstorm in 1686. And as Edmund cradled the newborn, he whispered a line Constance would remember with dread. 21 years, my boy, you have 21 years before you must prove yourself worthy of all I've built. More children followed. Thomas, James, Samuel, Benjamin, and 2 daughters, Margaret and Catherine in Ashwood, soon rang with laughter, study, and the lively chaos of a large family. Constance poured herself into raising them with education and integrity, teaching her daughters to read and encouraging all the children to think for themselves, while Edmund seemed the model of a patient, attentive father. Visitors often remarked on his pride in their accomplishments, but behind this mask, his love was a form of control. As his sons grew older and their ideas about justice and morality began to challenge his vision of legacy, he saw a threat. To him, Virginia's inheritance laws, which would grant these boys rights over the land he had built, became a ticking clock. Colonial law granted every son an automatic claim to his father's property at the age of 21, a right that could only be challenged in court and never quietly erased. Disinheritance was possible, but it meant dragging private family matters into the public eye, an option Edmund Aldermore would never consider. For a man whose very identity was built on control, the idea of idealistic sons dismantling everything he had built was intolerable. By the time William approached 16 in 1702, Edmund had already begun calculating a solution. The boy's independence had started to show in ways his father found dangerous, questioning the cruelty of slavery, talking about humane farming methods, even speaking of a moral duty that came with wealth. At family discussions, he no longer sat silent, but argued confident and articulate about reforming the very systems that had made the Aldermores powerful. The staff at Ashwood Manor noticed a subtle change in Edmund during those years. He began wandering the grounds alone, studying barns, fences, and outbuildings with a cold, deliberate interest. He asked odd questions about his children's routines, which paths they preferred for their rides, which chores they tackled without supervision. Most unsettling of all, he started keeping a locked journal written in a strange coded script. The housekeeper, Martha Henley, caught a glimpse of it once while cleaning. She saw dates, names, and diagrams of buildings, plans of some kind, but dared not ask questions. When William's 21st birthday drew near in the spring of 1707, Ashwood Manor prepared for what was expected to be the grandest event of the season. Invitations went out to Virginia's wealthiest families, and even the governor promised to attend. William, already admired for his intelligence and charm, was expected to step into society as a young man destined for greatness. But Edmund had been preparing for something else entirely. On the morning of April 15th, 1707, a flawless spring day, William awoke full of excitement, unaware that his father had been awake long before sunrise, setting his own plan in motion. The house buzzed with celebration. Servants polished silver-trimmed flowers and decorated the great hall with blossoms from Constance's garden. In the kitchen, the scent of roasting meats and fresh bread mingled with the sugary aroma of the Barbados sugar cake that would be the centerpiece of the evening's feast. Guests would soon arrive to witness William's coming of age, but he would never see the end of that day. Edmund moved through the house with a calm efficiency that disguised the fever-bright intensity in his eyes. When Constance asked if he was unwell, he dismissed her concern with a reassuring smile. By mid-morning, he approached William with a request that seemed perfectly reasonable. There were rumors that one of the old tobacco barns built back when he first cleared the land had been damaged by spring rains. As the heir, William should see for himself how to inspect such damage, how to protect the estate he would soon be responsible for. Proud to be treated as an adult, William agreed without hesitation, while his brothers and sisters busied themselves with final decorations and preparations for the evening. Father and son walked together down a sun-dappled path that led a quarter-mile from the house to the weathered barn, hidden among ancient oaks. The building smelled of old leaves and damp wood, its moss-covered roof blending with the trees that surrounded it. As they walked, Edmund asked questions, drawing William out, letting him speak freely about his dreams for the future. William thrilled at this rare show of trust, spoke with passion. He wanted a more humane estate, better conditions for the enslaved, modern farming methods, even diversification beyond tobacco. Every word confirmed Edmund's belief that his son's vision would destroy the Aldermore dynasty. Inside the shadowed barn, Edmund led him to the back wall, where a towering pyramid of heavy tobacco barrels rose almost 15 feet high. Edmund pointed to a patch of what looked like water damage on the upper support beam and told William to climb up for a closer look. It was a perfectly reasonable request. A future master of Ashwood needed to know how to spot structural weaknesses. Trusting his father, William began scaling the barrels with the easy grace of youth. Edmund stood below, his face calm, but his mind working with terrible precision. When William reached the top and began calling down observations about the beam, Edmund stepped to the base of the stack and with careful, deliberate force began to rock the bottom barrels. "Father, what are you?" William's voice was cut short as the stack shifted beneath him. The collapse was brutal and instantaneous. 7 full barrels each, weighing more than 200 pounds, thundered down in an avalanche of oak and iron. The barn echoed with the crash of splitting wood, the pounding of heavy staves, and a single scream that ended in an awful silence. When the dust settled, William lay crushed beneath the tobacco that had built the family fortune. Edmund stood still for a long moment, his breathing steady before running toward the house, shouting in a voice that carried across the fields. "Help, someone, help me. William's been hurt. There's been a terrible accident." The servants who arrived found nothing but devastation, broken barrels, splintered beams, and the lifeless body of the Aldermore heir. The scene told a simple story. A tragic failure of old timber, a young man unlucky enough to be there when it gave way. No one questioned it, no one except Thomas. At 17, he noticed 2 details he would never forget. First, his father's clothes, though covered in dust and splinters, were also stained with fresh moss and creek mud, the kind found only behind the barn. Second, he remembered seeing Edmund near this very building days before, tools in hand, working on something Thomas couldn't quite see. At the time, he'd thought nothing of it. Now, staring at the ruin and his brother's broken body, the memory cut deep. 3 days later, the entire Tidewater gentry gathered for William's funeral. Beneath a gray Virginia sky, he was laid to rest behind Ashwood Manor, beneath a headstone carved with a simple epitaph: William Edmund Aldermore, beloved son and heir, 1686 to 1707. The minister spoke of God's mysterious will as Constance wept and their younger children clung to one another in confusion. Margaret, at 18, wrapped her arms around little Catherine. The boys stood stiff and solemn, trying to appear older than their years. Only Edmund stood dry-eyed, his gaze fixed not on the coffin, but on the 4 remaining voices as they joined in prayer. And as they spoke the words of mercy and eternal rest, he silently counted the years left before each one would reach 21, 14, 12, 10, 8. That night, the house once a place of celebration became a tomb. Guests had left. The music was gone. And in the study upstairs behind a locked drawer, Edmund was already writing in his secret ledger, updating timelines and making new calculations. The children went to bed believing they had seen an accident. They had no idea they lived with a killer who had just perfected his method. In the years that followed, Ashwood Manor changed. The bright laughter that once rang down its polished halls grew muted, the air heavy with something no one could name. Constance withdrew into the small chapel on the property, spending hours in prayer. She told herself it was grief, but deep down she had begun to notice patterns she could not ignore. The strange timing of William's accident, Edmund's composure in public, and his cold detachment in private, and most disturbing of all the way, he now studied their sons with an intensity that had never been there before. Thomas, now the eldest, responded to tragedy by throwing himself into responsibility. Unlike William's idealism, his strength lay in practicality. By 19, he had become indispensable managing plantation affairs, negotiating contracts, and winning the respect of powerful men in Richmond and Norfolk. Families with daughters whispered about him as one of Virginia's most eligible bachelors. But Edmund, watching closely, saw not an heir, but a threat. Thomas's clear, calculating intelligence, his willingness to modernize the estate, even his idea of improving conditions for enslaved workers, not out of kindness, but for efficiency, told Edmund one thing. Another son was becoming strong enough to challenge him, and Edmund would not allow that to happen. Father Thomas said one spring afternoon in 1709, during one of their business discussions, "I've been studying the Randolph plantation. If we provide better housing and nutrition for our people, we could raise our tobacco yield by at least 15%. It would cost more at first, but the profits would more than make up for it." Edmund smiled warmly, praising his son's clever thinking, and made careful notes in what looked like an ordinary business ledger. That evening, behind the locked door of his study, he transferred those notes into his coded journal. Alongside figures and diagrams, he added new observations about Thomas, his routines, his strength, and his habit of inspecting buildings on his own. For the next 2 years, Thomas took on more of the estate's responsibilities, unaware that he was giving his father everything he needed to plan his death. Edmund's methods had changed since William's murder. He moved slower, watched more closely, and studied how to create accidents that no one would question. Martha Henley, the loyal head housekeeper, began noticing things others ignored. In the dark hours before dawn, when the manor slept, she saw Edmund walking the grounds carrying tools he quickly hid whenever someone drew near. She noticed cut marks on old beams, ropes altered in odd ways, and equipment stored where it didn't belong. It looked, she realized with a shiver, like experiments, small, careful tests to learn how and when wood, stone, and weight might fail. As Thomas's 21st birthday drew near in 1709, the family prepared for another grand celebration meant to honor not only Thomas, but also the memory of William. Constance poured her heart into the arrangements, convinced that beauty and festivity might protect this son from the cruel fate of the last. Invitations went out to the most prominent families. Edmund ordered fine gifts, surveying instruments, and a matched set of pistols from London. Outwardly, it promised to be the grandest gathering Ashwood had ever seen. Then, while cleaning Edmund's study, Martha found the journal unlocked and partly open. She couldn't read the strange cipher, but what she could see was enough to chill her blood. Page after page of diagrams, barn interiors, storehouses covered in precise calculations about weights and leverage. And at the top of one page in plain letters, a name, Thomas. Below it, a sequence of dates that ended with April 15th, 1709, Thomas's 21st birthday. Martha faced an impossible choice. A servant accusing her master of murder would be dismissed as hysterical, if not punished for slander. Yet she could not stand by and watch another child die. She turned to Dr. Marcus Fairfax, the same physician who had attended William on the day of his death, and who in quiet moments had admitted his doubts about that so-called accident. She told him everything: the journal, the strange night walks, the tampered beams. The doctor listened carefully, asking for details, then came to a grim conclusion. Edmund Aldermore was preparing to kill again. The only way to stop him was to catch him in the act. Together, they made a plan. On the morning of Thomas's birthday, Fairfax and a few trusted allies would take up hidden positions across the estate. Martha would watch Edmund inside the house, while Constance, now drawn into the desperate conspiracy, would do everything she could to keep Thomas where help could reach him quickly. But Edmund had been planning far longer than they had. On the evening of April 14th, as the manor bustled with final preparations, he came to Thomas with news that seemed like a golden opportunity. A ship had just docked in Richmond with a Dutch buyer offering to pay well above market price for tobacco, but he would be leaving the next day. "If we leave at dawn, we can meet him before noon," Edmund said. "This contract could make this our most profitable year yet. I know it means missing your birthday party, but this is the kind of decision a man must learn to make." Thomas, practical and ambitious, understood at once. Business before celebration. Without hesitation, he agreed to go. The plan was simple. Leave Ashwood before dawn, ride to Richmond, secure the deal, and return home in time for a smaller family supper. What Thomas could not know was that there was no ship, no Amsterdam merchant, no business deal at all. The story was a snare designed to get him alone on the open road, where his death could be staged without inconvenient witnesses. Edmund had been preparing this for months. He had chosen the perfect stretch of road, a lonely track through the dense Miller's Creek forest, a place where real bandits sometimes struck travelers. It was an ideal setting for a staged robbery. He had already recruited the killers, a small gang of hardened ex-soldiers introduced by Jacob Fletcher, men desperate enough to kill for coin, skilled enough to make it look authentic, and expendable enough to die if necessary, so that no one lived to tell the truth. But Edmund had not counted on the quiet watch kept by Martha Henley and Dr. Marcus Fairfax. When they saw father and son leaving before dawn, they knew this journey was a death sentence unless someone intervened. Fairfax and a handful of allies mounted their horses and slipped into the woods, keeping to the shadows as the riders departed. Mist clung to the trees as Edmund and Thomas saddled their horses, leather bags packed with forged business papers. Thomas, still thinking only of the opportunity ahead, spoke eagerly about the Amsterdam connection. Edmund, cool and collected, checked his pocket watch with unnerving frequency. Even in the pale half-light, Dr. Fairfax, hidden behind the oaks, could see the telltale bulge beneath Edmund's coat, a weapon far larger than a gentleman's traveling pistol. As the sound of hooves faded, Fairfax signaled his confederates to follow at a safe distance. If an ambush came, they needed to be close enough to act, without revealing their presence too soon. The road to Richmond wound toward Miller's Creek Forest, just as Fairfax had predicted. 5 miles from the manor, where the path narrowed between steep banks and a shallow stream cut across the road. Edmund's plan was to spring the trap. The gang waited in the shadows, ready to stage the bloody spectacle. Yet Thomas's keen instincts complicated everything. As they approached the dark tangle of trees, his horse grew uneasy, ears flicking toward unseen movement in the underbrush. He pulled on the reins and glanced sharply around. Father Thomas said quietly, "The horses know we're not alone. There's someone out there." For a moment, Edmund's mask cracked, but only for an instant. "Nonsense," he said briskly. "You're imagining things. We've ridden this way dozens of times. We don't have time for detours, Thomas. Business comes first." That one decision to dismiss his son's warning, rather than feign caution, would unravel months of careful planning. From the shadows behind them came the pounding of hooves. Dr. Fairfax rode out of the mist, forcing his horse onto the road. "Edmund Thomas, thank God I've caught you." His voice was deliberately loud, carrying straight into the woods, where the ambushers crouched. Edmund's face went rigid with fury. Every second that passed made it harder to signal the men without exposing himself. "Dr. Fairfax," Edmund said, his voice tight. "What on earth are you doing out here before dawn? And why the alarm?" Fairfax, prepared for this exact moment, didn't hesitate. He sat tall in the saddle, his tone commanding. "I received word late last night from one of my patients in Richmond," he said. "There have been several robberies along this stretch of road in the last 2 days. 2 men dead already. I came as fast as I could to intercept you before you reached the dangerous part of the forest. There have been 3 attacks on travelers through Miller's Creek this week," Dr. Fairfax said, keeping his voice steady. "One just yesterday left 2 men dead and their cargo stolen. The militia knows, but they haven't yet cleared the forest." Thomas instantly understood the danger and instinctively wanted to avoid it. Edmund, however, reacted with frustration rather than gratitude. "Dr. Fairfax," he said sharply, "I appreciate your concern, but rumors about highwaymen will not derail a business opportunity of this magnitude. Thomas and I are armed and experienced riders. We can manage whatever trouble the road offers." For several tense minutes, the doctor pressed the issue, supplying one grim detail after another. While Edmund grew visibly impatient, Thomas began to question the entire premise of their journey. Father Thomas said slowly, his brow furrowed, "If this Amsterdam buyer is real and offering such extraordinary prices, Why did none of our contacts in Richmond mention him? A ship that important doesn't just appear without word spreading long before it docks. The question cut straight through the lie. Edmund's mask faltered, and for a moment Dr. Fairfax saw the truth in his eyes. He understood the plan was crumbling. And then the predator struck. Without warning, Edmund's hand went inside his coat. Gone was the businessman's charm, replaced by cold, lethal intent. The pistol he drew was no gentleman's ornament, but a heavy military weapon built for one purpose. "I'm sorry, son," Edmund said, his voice flat, a strange mixture of regret and iron certainty. "But like your brother before you, you've grown too independent. Too dangerous. These inheritance laws leave me no choice." Thomas, who had been watching closely, reacted on instinct. He dove from his horse as the pistol roared, the shot grazing his sleeve and splintering the bark of a tree behind him. He hit the ground hard, rolled into the underbrush, and shouted for help with every breath in his lungs. Dr. Fairfax, prepared for just such a moment, spurred his horse straight at Edmund. The doctor's shoulder slammed into the older man's arm as he cocked for a second shot, sending the pistol firing harmlessly into the air. Edmund toppled from his horse, rolling in the dust. The sound of pounding hooves filled the road as Fairfax's hidden allies charged in, drawn by the gunfire. Within moments, Edmund was surrounded, unarmed, his plans shattered. Even then, he tried to regain control. Straightening his coat, brushing the dirt from his sleeve, he spoke as if he were still at the head of a boardroom table. "Gentlemen, you have interfered in a private family matter. My son has made threats against my life, against the security of everything we've built. What you just witnessed was a father defending himself." The audacity of the claim, so utterly at odds with everything they had seen, froze the men in silence. Then Thomas stepped out of the trees, coat torn, face pale but resolute. "Dr. Fairfax," he said, his voice shaking but firm, "my father just confessed to killing William. He said that both William and I were threats to his control of the estate, and that he had no choice but to remove us before we reached 21. The words hung in the misty air like a verdict. The men turned to Edmund. There was no denial. Instead, something darker crept across his face, a cold, consuming rage, as the fragile illusion of the devoted patriarch finally collapsed. "You understand nothing," Edmund said, his voice calm and sharp as a blade. "Everything you see around you exists because of sacrifice decisions you are too young and too soft to comprehend. I gave my sons every opportunity to prove themselves worthy of this legacy, and what did they do? Question me. Question the methods that have made this family the wealthiest in Henrio County." Just when his confession cut deepest, I need to pause for a moment. If this revelation stuns you as much as it does me, hit like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And before we uncover what Edmund planned for his remaining sons, which is even more horrifying, tell me in the comments, did Thomas suspect his father's true nature before this moment? Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about the Aldermores. Dr. Fairfax wasn't about to let the confession vanish without record or justice. The return to Ashwood Manor that morning was like a funeral procession in reverse. Edmund rode at the center of a ring of armed men hands, bound his face hard with the realization that his carefully built life was collapsing. Beside him, Thomas rode in silence, still shaken by how close he had come to dying at his own father's hands, just as William had 2 years before. In the garden, Constance was arranging flowers with Margaret and Catherine when she saw the group of riders coming up the drive. At first, she feared an accident, but as they neared, she saw that Edmund was a prisoner. The younger boys, James, Samuel, Benjamin, were playing near the portico and froze at the sight of their father in chains. Inside the great hall, Dr. Fairfax gathered the family and spoke with the measured gravity of a man who knew the truth could shatter them. "Mrs. Aldermore," he began, "I'm afraid what I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear. Your husband has confessed to murdering William, and this morning we stopped him from killing Thomas as well." The silence was unbearable. Constance turned as white as the lilies in her hands. The children looked at their father, waiting for him to deny it. It was Margaret, now 20, who finally spoke. "That's impossible. Father loved William. He wept at the funeral." Edmund lifted his head and answered without shame. "William was going to destroy everything. He spoke of freeing our slaves, treating them as equals. Do you know what that would have meant? The collapse of our plantation, our ruin. I did what had to be done to preserve this family." Constance staggered to her feet. "Edmund," she whispered. "What do you say?" "I am saying," Edmund replied, cold and unwavering, "that William and Thomas, both of them, were dangerous. They questioned my authority. The law would have handed them half of everything at 21, regardless of whether they were fit to manage it. I will not see decades of work undone by reckless boys. The revelation struck like thunder. James, 19, took a step back as though his father had become something monstrous. Samuel and Benjamin stared in stunned incomprehension. Then Dr. Fairfax asked the question no one else dared. And what of James, Samuel, and Benjamin? Were you planning to kill them as well? Of course, Edmund said, as if the answer were obvious. The law doesn't distinguish. James will be 21 in 1711. Samuel in 1713. Benjamin in 1715. Each of them would have faced the same choice: submit to my authority or be removed. The words fell on the boys, like blows. James's face went ashen. Samuel and Benjamin, still barely more than children, looked around in terror, realizing the man who had taught them to ride and shoot had been planning their deaths all along. From the doorway, Martha Henley stepped forward. Dr. Fairfax, she said, her voice steady, you should know there is proof. Master Edmund has kept a coded journal in his study. It contains diagrams, calculations, and timelines for every one of these deaths. That single revelation changed everything. The conspiracy was no longer just Edmund's word against theirs. It could be proven. Fairfax ordered the study sealed and the journal retrieved. But even now, confronted with evidence, Edmund's face lit with something like pride. That journal represents 27 years of careful planning, he said. Every contingency, every possibility. Catching me with Thomas is no victory. Even if you imprison or hang me, the problem remains. These boys will inherit the power to destroy everything I've built, unless someone stops them permanently. The words hung in the air like a curse, making clear that Edmund Aldermore would rather annihilate his bloodline than lose control. Edmund had not only murdered William and tried to kill Thomas, he had built a machine of death that would continue even without him. Dr. Fairfax, hearing Edmund speak, understood this was no ordinary case of family violence. This was a system, a conspiracy designed to survive the man who created it. Edmund, the doctor said, his voice urgent. What arrangements have you made? Who else is involved? Edmund's reply was as cold as the iron manacles around his wrists. A slow smile crept across his face, calm and confident. Dr. Fairfax, he said quietly, did you really believe I spent 27 years planning these deaths without preparing for the possibility of my own absence? My work is woven into the very routines of this estate. You will never find it all. And even if you do, it's too late to stop it. The family sat frozen, the full horror sinking in. It wasn't just that he had murdered one son and tried to kill another. He had created something that would keep hunting James, Samuel, and Benjamin long after he was gone. Constance, pale and shaking, found her voice at last. Edmund, she whispered, how do we stop this? Tell me what we have to do to keep our children safe. There is no stopping it, he answered with finality. The only way to protect what I've built is to make certain that no male heir lives to inherit it. I have accepted that responsibility. Whether I am here or not, those plans will be carried out. But Fairfax had spent a lifetime studying human nature. No plan, however intricate, was truly unstoppable. Somewhere in Edmund's scheme, there had to be weaknesses. Allies who could be turned. Methods that could be disrupted. The race to save James, Samuel, and Benjamin had begun. The search of Edmund's study revealed horrors even worse than Fairfax had imagined. The infamous coded journal was only the beginning. Behind false panels and hidden compartments lay a private archive of murder. The entries began in 1681, long before Edmund ever set foot in Virginia. There were notes about warehouse fires in Bristol, including the one that killed his nephew Peter, early practice runs in removing obstacles to inheritance. In the margins, Edmund had recorded lessons learned: how to stage accidents, how to misdirect witnesses, how to time everything for maximum effect. But it was the Virginia entries that revealed the full scope of his obsession. Each son had been studied like a subject in a scientific experiment. Their personalities, habits, strengths, and fears were cataloged in ruthless detail. William's file contained architectural diagrams of the tobacco barn where he dyed barrel weights, calculated to the pound sketches of the stack, showing exactly how it would collapse. Notes in the margin described his trusting nature and unquestioning obedience traits Edmund had turned into a weapon. Thomas's file was more complex, a list of multiple elimination scenarios. The ambush had been only one plan. Edmund had considered a hunting accident, a drowning during a fishing trip, even poisoning him with tobacco extracts disguised as accidental exposure. The files for James, Samuel, and Benjamin chilled Fairfax to his core. These were not just murder plans, they were psychological profiles. James, now 19, was marked as curious and impulsive, vulnerable to accidental failures of equipment or structures. There were sketches of sabotaged farm tools, weakened bridges, even plans to trigger sinkholes beneath him. Samuel's file detailed his passion for horses and racing. Edmund had laid out methods to drug certain animals, booby-trap saddles, or set traps on Samuel's favorite trails to ensure a fatal fall. And Benjamin, barely 15, was obsessed with hunting. For him, Edmund had planned to sabotage gunpowder so a rifle would explode on firing, turning a lesson in marksmanship into a fatal accident. Most disturbing of all were the notes scattered throughout each file, coded references to other people, servants, merchants, hired men, already instructed on how to proceed if Edmund was unable to act himself. It was a web designed to keep killing even in his absence. Dr. Fairfax closed the journal with a grim realization capturing Edmund was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would decide the survival of the remaining Aldermore children, had just begun. The breakthrough came when Martha Henley recognized a name that appeared again and again in the coded journals, Fletcher. Every reference connected to tasks that Edmund delegated outside the family. Martha suddenly remembered Jacob Fletcher, the drifter, who had once brought false news of a dying relative, and how he had been seen repeatedly on the property in recent years, always arriving with unexplained deliveries and reporting only to Edmund. Dr. Fairfax, Martha said urgently, I think Fletcher is more than a messenger. These entries make it sound like he was arranging backup plans. If anything happened to Master Edmund Fletcher, would make sure the boy still died. The realization changed everything. This was no longer only a family crisis, it was a conspiracy that reached far beyond the walls of Ashwood Manor. Fairfax immediately sent riders to Richmond and Norfolk, with descriptions of Fletcher calling for the help of the Colonial militia. But even in chains, Edmund radiated calm certainty. You found my records, he said coldly, when confronted with the evidence, but you still have no idea how vast this is. Fletcher is one piece of a larger design. There are others who have no idea they are part of it. You can take me away, but the system I built will continue. The interrogations that followed revealed the horrifying elegance of Edmund's design. For 27 years, he had used ordinary tasks, blacksmith work, carpentry, household repairs, to weave a network of hidden dangers around his sons. A blacksmith made modified horseshoes designed to fail at a gallop. A carpenter built improvements into barns and bridges that would one day collapse. Even the household staff, following his seemingly innocent instructions about meals, schedules, and maintenance, had unknowingly created conditions that would make accidents inevitable. None of these people understood they were tools in a web designed to destroy the Aldermore heirs. Fairfax and Constance began a frantic investigation, recruiting the older children to search every outbuilding and field. Every item Edmund had ordered over the years was re-examined. But time was against them. James would turn 21 in less than 2 years, and death traps already in place could strike at any time. The danger became terrifyingly real when Thomas, combing through the stables, made a discovery that nearly stole his breath. Several saddles had been altered with thin, hidden wires that would cut through the leather straps under the stress of fast riding. It was so subtle it escaped normal inspection. Samuel, who loved racing, had been using those saddles for months. My God, Thomas said, carrying the sabotaged tack to Dr. Fairfax. If Samuel had decided to race today, he'd be dead. Exactly as father planned. The evidence proved that Edmund's plots had already been set in motion and could have killed Samuel at any time. It also gave Fairfax the proof he needed to convince the authorities that Edmund's conspiracy was a threat that could not be ignored. The final confrontation came in the great hall of Ashwood Manor. Before the assembled family, Dr. Fairfax laid out the coded journals, the sabotaged saddles, and the modified equipment in front of Edmund. Edmund Fairfax said quietly, "We have enough here to prove that you plan to murder your sons a dozen different ways. The only question left is whether you will help us dismantle the rest, or whether you prefer to leave them to live every day in fear of traps you've hidden that we have not yet found." Even then, Edmund's expression was one of control, not remorse. "You still don't understand," he said evenly. "This system was never about bloodlust. It was about preservation. I built something extraordinary, something your kind of idealistic sons could destroy in a single generation. My work ensures that can't happen." What followed was both a confession and a blueprint. With chilling pride, Edmund gave up the names of his accomplices, the locations of hidden traps, and the triggers designed to activate his backup plans. Not to repent, but to demonstrate just how brilliant and unstoppable his scheme was. "You can arrest Fletcher and the others," he said at last, "but you cannot arrest an idea. Someday another father will face the same choice. Let everything he's built be torn apart or act. And when that day comes, they will look at what I've done and improve upon it. For weeks, Henrico County became the stage for one of the largest investigations Colonial Virginia had ever seen. Fletcher was caught trying to escape south to the Carolinas. His testimony led to the capture of others men who had been paid to make innocent modifications that were in truth carefully staged death traps. Piece by piece, the hidden weapons and designs were dismantled from the estate. But the shadow of Edmund Aldermore's legacy hung over Ashwood Manor, long after the last of his conspiracies had been torn apart. The buildings were repaired, the hidden traps dismantled, and Edmund's network of accomplices hunted down. Yet the damage to the Aldermore family ran deeper than timber and stone. On October 15, 1709, 6 months after the failed ambush, Edmund Aldermore was hanged in Richmond before a crowd that included every prominent Tidewater family. His death was both punishment and warning. Standing on the gallows, Edmund faced the crowd with the same cold authority that had ruled his household. "I die. Knowing I did everything possible to preserve the legacy I built," he declared, his voice calm even as the rope was placed around his neck. "If my sons choose to destroy that legacy with their naive ideals, the responsibility will be theirs alone." When the trap fell, the long nightmare of his control ended, but the consequences had only begun. Constance Aldermore inherited everything by law, but the land and fortune were poisoned by blood. Guided by Dr. Fairfax and a small circle of reform-minded officials, she set about transforming the legacy from horror to redemption. Her first act was to free every enslaved person on the estate. More than 60 men, women, and children were granted their freedom resources to begin new lives and the option to remain as paid workers. The decision cost a fortune, but sent a shockwave through Virginia's planter class, forcing others to confront the cost of their wealth. Martha Henley was given her freedom and appointed head of security for the estate, her sharp instincts now tasked with protecting the surviving children from threats. With Dr. Fairfax, Constance founded the Aldermore Foundation, the first colonial organization dedicated to investigating suspicious family deaths and preventing inheritance-motivated violence. Their work would uncover similar cases across the colonies, leading to reforms that made such crimes harder to conceal. Thomas never fully recovered from the betrayal. Choosing a solitary life, he devoted himself to the Foundation's work, helping change Virginia law to require witnesses for inheritance transfers and penalties for coercion or violence. James became a lawyer, specializing in family law. Samuel, inspired by the near-fatal trap laid for him, created Virginia's first organized system for domestic violence investigations. Benjamin, the youngest, chose a military career seeking to protect others from predators like the father he once trusted. Margaret and Catherine, though spared from direct danger, carried the scars of growing up in a house where murder was planned in silence. Margaret became one of the first women to argue for legal protections for wives and daughters, while Catherine established schools and sanctuaries for children threatened by their own families. Constance lived until 1759, dedicating her life to ensuring that the Aldermore name would be remembered for redemption, not blood. She never remarried, saying Edmund had taught her that evil often hides behind respectability. The evidence of Edmund's crimes, his coded journals, altered tools, and written confessions, was preserved by Dr. Fairfax and eventually entrusted to what became the Virginia Historical Society. These files, sealed for over 2 centuries, have been opened only to scholars studying the psychology of inheritance-driven murder. Ashwood Manor itself was sold after Constance's death, changing hands many times. Locals whispered of ghosts, but the Foundation's records suggest those stories were encouraged by owners hoping to keep prying eyes away from the house's bloody history. The family cemetery behind Ashwood tells the truth more plainly than any legend. William's headstone stands alone. Beside it, 5 empty plots lie waiting the graves Edmund intended for Thomas, James, Samuel, Benjamin, and every future son who would dare challenge him. Those graves remain empty, a silent monument to the lives that courage saved. Edmund himself lies far from them, buried alone, his name carved into a solitary marker, cut off in death as he was in life. The Aldermore case became the cornerstone of the Foundation's research into domestic violence and inheritance-motivated murder. It revealed how carefully family predators can hide behind respectability and how dangerous that secrecy can be. The patterns Dr. Fairfax documented, narcissism, meticulous planning, complete lack of empathy, still inform modern criminal profiling. Historians studying the case note that its true horror lies not in its violence, but in its ordinariness. Edmund was not a madman. He was a calm, methodical patriarch who convinced himself that murder was a rational tool for protecting wealth. His actions shattered the illusion that danger comes only from outside the home. So what do you think? Were all of Edmund's accomplices truly caught? Or did some escape, carrying his ideas into other families? The records hint that his influence may have reached far beyond Henrico County, inspiring other accidents in other houses. Leave a comment with your theory. And if you've been captivated by this true story from America's colonial past, subscribe and join us for the next episode, where the line between history and horror blurs once again. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are often the ones wearing the mask of love. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.